The transmission crackled through the silence of his outpost, a father's desperate voice cutting through years of isolation. "Mighty human! My mother's been taken, save her!" Kale's fingers paused over the console, his enhanced senses registering the man's raw terror. For a weapon designed for war, this plea felt different. It wasn't a command from superiors, but a cry from someone who believed he could be more than destruction. The outpost maintained its steady mechanical hum, a low-frequency drone that had been Kyle's only company for 17 standard cycles. He moved through the maintenance checks with neural efficiency, each motion perfected through countless repetitions. His fingers tested connection ports, his palms smoothed over cooling vents, his eyes scanned readouts without truly seeing them. The routine felt etched into his muscle memory, a programmed dance of upkeep for a body and station both designed for war. His enhanced hearing registered every subtle shift in the station's rhythm, the faint whir of hidden processors, the almost imperceptible vibration of life support systems, the distant sigh of air recycling through filtration units. He acknowledged each sound with a detached part of his consciousness, then filed it away as non-threatening data. His hands completed tasks without conscious direction, tools moving from one panel to another with mechanical precision. He existed in standby mode, a weapon waiting for a command that might never come. Studies of prolonged isolation show that soldiers develop heightened sensory awareness as a survival adaptation, their systems becoming attuned to the smallest environmental changes. Kale demonstrated this phenomenon perfectly, though he would never describe it in those terms. He simply knew the station's normal state so completely that any variation would trigger immediate alertness. He deliberately angled his body away from reflective surfaces as he worked. The polished metal of equipment panels, the dark glass of inactive monitors, all offered glimpses of a face he preferred not to examine. This small rebellion against his design had become part of the daily ritual. The silence surrounding him wasn't peaceful. It was an empty space that allowed ghosts from previous deployments to surface at the edges of his awareness. Memories of combat zones, of orders followed without question, of the specific sound armored plating makes when pierced by energy fire. Every movement he made was economical, designed to conserve energy for moments when it might be needed. He turned with precise angular efficiency, stepped with measured gait, breathed with optimized rhythm. His entire existence had been engineered for maximum performance with minimal waste. The anticipation built in the contrast between his hyper-awareness and his deliberate inaction, between the weapon's readiness and the soldier's withdrawal from engagement. Then the console's status light shifted from steady green to urgent red. The change was instantaneous, a visual assault that cut through his artificial peace. The hum of the station continued unchanged, but everything had suddenly become different. The light pulsed with rhythmic intensity, each flash a silent demand for attention that his programming couldn't ignore. His hand stilled above the maintenance panel, tools hanging motionless in his grip. The routine had been broken, the silence shattered by a signal that shouldn't exist this far from command channels. The transmission struck his senses like a physical blow, a burst of static that made his neural implants flare with warning signals. Kale's hand froze exactly 6 inches above the console interface, fingers curled in a half-completed diagnostic gesture. The voice that followed the initial burst carried a frequency his systems had been designed to filter out, pure, unadulterated terror that bypassed all his audio dampeners. This wasn't the clean military code he'd been conditioned to expect, nor the clipped tones of official channels. The voice rasped through the speakers with the raw texture of desperation, each word strained through what sounded like recently shed tears. Military research into neural responses shows that distress signals activate different pathways than combat commands, triggering protective instincts rather than aggressive ones. Kale's body remained motionless while his systems processed this unexpected input. The man's accent marked him immediately as frontier colonist, his vowels flattened by isolation and his consonants softened by the distinctive lilt of the outer settlements. He spoke the trade language, but with the distinctive cadence of someone far from central authority, his speech patterns suggesting generations lived beyond the core systems. Kale's translation implants rendered every choked sob with perfect clarity, analyzing vocal stress patterns and physiological indicators of distress even through the poor connection. His tactical analysis subroutines activated automatically, assessing threat level and calculating probability matrices. The system flagged the transmission as non-standard, unauthorized and potentially hazardous. It began running protocols to trace the signal's origin, while cross-referencing vocal patterns against known insurgent databases. Every parameter indicated this communication should be terminated immediately for security reasons. Yet Kale remained motionless, his hand still suspended above the console. The man's words began to penetrate the emotional shields that had taken years to construct. He spoke of a mother taken in the night, of missing colonists, of something moving through solid walls. The desperation in his voice carried a quality Kyle hadn't encountered since leaving active service, the raw need of someone who had exhausted all other options. Then, the colonist used the term that changed everything: mighty human. The words struck an unfamiliar chord within him, resonating in spaces his designers had never intended to access. Commanders had called him asset, weapon, soldier. Technicians referred to him as specimen, prototype, construct. This man spoke the words as both title and plea, as if addressing some legendary figure from frontier folklore rather than a military instrument. The term hung in the air between transmission and receiver, a concept that felt both foreign and disturbingly appropriate. The father's voice fractured on the word mother, the syllable catching in his throat like something breaking. Kyle stood motionless at the console, his enhanced hearing capturing every nuance of that single strained vowel. His systems processed the emotional payload with clinical efficiency, measuring vocal stress levels, analyzing breath patterns, calculating the precise frequency of despair in the man's trembling tenor. The data streamed through his neural pathways as cold information, but something else moved beneath the surface of his programming. His protocols demanded immediate termination of non-secure communications. Security protocols flashed warnings across his visual field, recommending signal jamming and trace initiation. The training drilled into him through countless simulations insisted that emotional contagion represented a critical vulnerability in combat units. Yet his hand remained at his side, fingers resting against the console's cool surface rather than executing the required security sequence. The colonist described the disappearance with confused urgency. She'd been taken in the dead of night without any signs of forced entry. No defensive wounds on the bedding, no energy signatures on the sensors, no disruptions to the environmental seals. His voice painted a picture of perfect stealth, of something that moved through their settlement like smoke through screening mesh. Psychological studies of frontier communities show that unexplained disappearances trigger primal fears that bypass rational explanation, creating narratives that often incorporate local mythology and collective trauma. Kale's memory banks scanned through thousands of mission profiles and engagement reports. He searched for patterns matching this description: covert extractions, stealth incursions, psychological operations. The databases returned no comparable scenarios. This wasn't standard military procedure or known insurgent tactics. The absence of matches created a peculiar void in his assessment matrices, a blank space where tactical certainty should have been. The man's speech shifted to folklore, to stories passed down through generations of colonists about mighty humans from the old wars. He spoke of legendary warriors who could withstand impossible odds, who protected the vulnerable when authority failed, who answered calls from those with nowhere else to turn. The stories had the rough texture of oral history, polished by retelling but retaining their core of desperate hope. Every combat instinct screamed that this fell far outside mission parameters, that engagement represented unacceptable risk without strategic justification, that his programming contained no protocols for responding to mythological appeals. His index finger moved toward the disconnect button, the motion initiated by training rather than conscious decision. The tip of his finger hovered millimeters above the illuminated control, its red glow reflecting in the synthetic skin of his fingerprint. His combat-enhanced musculature held the position with perfect stillness, the disconnect command poised for execution. The security protocols continued their insistent flashing. The tactical assessment maintained its negative recommendation. The risk analysis showed probability curves trending sharply toward disaster. His finger remained suspended. The disconnect command went unexecuted. The transmission continued to pour through the speakers, the colonist's voice now describing his mother's laugh, the way she could repair any machinery with scrap parts, how she remembered every colonist's birthday. The personal details transformed her from an abstract mission parameter into a specific human being with value beyond tactical considerations. The hesitation lasted exactly 3.2 seconds, an eternity for a system designed to make decisions in milliseconds. In that space between protocol and action, something fundamental began to shift within him. Kale flexed his right hand slowly, watching the synthetic muscle fibers ripple beneath the pale imitation skin. Each tendon and ligament had been engineered for maximum tensile strength, capable of exerting pressure that could crush military-grade alloys. The hand that could tear through armored plating now hung motionless in the air, suspended between action and inaction. These physical capabilities represented a fundamental conflict. They had been designed exclusively for destruction, yet the plea demanded something entirely different. His skeletal structure incorporated polycarbonate weaving throughout the bone matrix, a reinforcement that allowed him to withstand impacts that would shatter ordinary human frames. The engineering could absorb the recoil of heavy weapons fire, or survive structural collapses that would bury conventional soldiers. Every physical enhancement served a singular combat purpose, optimized for environments where survival meant overwhelming force applied without hesitation. Military research into enhanced soldiers consistently shows they struggle with non-combat applications, their training and physiologies creating specialized tools rather than adaptable beings. Neural implants allowed his brain to process sensory input at 5 times normal human speed, giving him what soldiers called combat time, the ability to perceive threats and opportunities in what appeared to others as blurred instants. This accelerated cognition enabled complex tactical assessments in the middle of firefights, calculating trajectories, monitoring multiple enemies, and coordinating with squad members through enhanced communication links. The system excelled at processing violence, at breaking down chaotic combat into manageable data streams. His metabolic system could operate for 72 hours without nourishment when fully activated, converting stored energy reserves with brutal efficiency. The process bypassed normal human limitations, suppressing fatigue signals and pain responses to maintain operational readiness. This endurance had been tested in extended combat deployments where rest represented vulnerability, and nourishment came from concentrated nutrient paste designed for maximum caloric density. Every system reflected the same philosophy: efficiency, endurance, and lethal effectiveness. The designers had created a perfect instrument for projected force, removing anything that might compromise combat performance. Emotion dampeners, pain suppressors, accelerated healing, all served the single purpose of maintaining functionality in extreme environments. The concept of applying these capabilities outside destructive contexts had never been part of the design parameters. As the colonist's voice continued through the speakers, describing the specific way his mother's hands could repair broken machinery with scrap components, Kale's enhanced vision focused on his own hands. The same fingers that could crush skulls or dismantle weapons with equal precision now hung open, empty. The neural implants that could calculate ballistic trajectories in microseconds began running unfamiliar calculations. How much pressure would be required to pry open a damaged door without collapsing the structure? How quickly he could move through confined spaces without causing panic? How to approach vulnerable civilians without triggering their defensive instincts? For the first time since his activation, he considered that his design might serve purposes beyond its intended function. The polycarbonate reinforced bones could support collapsing structures instead of merely surviving them. The enhanced strength could lift debris to free trapped survivors, rather than only breaching defenses. The accelerated processing could analyze rescue scenarios with the same precision it applied to combat engagements. The metabolic endurance could sustain search operations through multiple sleep cycles. The realization arrived not as a dramatic revelation, but as a quiet recalibration of possibility. A shift in perspective that transformed weapons into tools and destruction into potential preservation. Kyle's vision blurred at the edges, the console light smearing into streaks of color. The neural barriers he'd maintained for years began to fracture under the weight of the colonist's plea. Memories surged through the cracks, jagged fragments of missions he'd buried deep in his cognitive archives. Smoke filled his senses despite the station's sterile air, the acrid smell of burning composites mixing with the coppery scent of blood. Screams echoed in his auditory memory. Not the clean terror of training simulations, but the raw, messy sound of real combat. He remembered clearing habitats on frontier worlds not unlike the one this colonist described. The structures had the same makeshift quality, the same patched-together appearance of settlements built with limited resources and immense determination. His unit would move through them with efficient brutality, following orders that left no room for questions about the people who called those places home. The memories arrived not as coherent narratives but as sensory flashes, the vibration of energy weapons fire, the sound of bootsteps on metal grating, the sight of personal belongings scattered amid the destruction. Research into genetically modified soldiers shows trauma manifests differently in enhanced individuals. Their memories aren't processed through normal neurological pathways but stored as data streams that can be accessed and analyzed. Kale's experience matched this pattern. The memories felt less like recollections and more like mission files being reviewed, complete with tactical assessments and after-action reports. The taste of blood filtered through his olfactory memory banks, a specific metallic tang that his enhanced senses had recorded with uncomfortable precision during close-quarters engagements. His handlers' voices echoed through the recall, their tones flat and authoritative. "You are purpose-built. Do not question." The phrases repeated like programmed mantras, the same words they'd used when he'd hesitated, when he'd shown the slightest resistance to commands that felt increasingly wrong. The programming held firm even now, the conditioning so deep it felt like part of his physical construction rather than something learned or acquired. Every rescue attempt from his previous deployments surfaced in his memory with painful clarity. The patterns were always the same: initial engagement, tactical assessment, followed by calculated termination when rescue proved impossible or strategically unwise. The assessments always favored mission success over individual survival, operational security over humanitarian concerns. He remembered faces briefly glimpsed through smoke or debris, people who represented acceptable losses according to the parameters set by command. The memories built toward a clear understanding of why this situation felt different. Previous engagements had been dictated by command decisions, by strategic calculations made far from the actual conflict. This cry for help came directly from the source, from someone who had chosen to reach out rather than following procedure or waiting for authorized response. The colonist's voice carried no military authority, no chain of command validation, no strategic justification. It was simply one human asking another for help, bypassing all the systems and protocols that had defined Kale's existence. He understood the fundamental difference now. This wasn't a command to be followed but a choice to be made. The colonist had chosen to believe in the legends of mighty humans, had chosen to risk everything on a desperate transmission to an unknown recipient. That element of choice changed everything. It created a reciprocity that military orders never contained. For the first time, someone was asking rather than commanding, hoping rather than demanding. The realization settled into his consciousness not as an emotional epiphany, but as a tactical reassessment of the entire situation. The parameters had shifted from obedience to decision, from execution to response. Kale's mind shifted into tactical mode, his neural processors running probability simulations with cold mechanical precision. The scenarios unfolded across his enhanced vision as overlapping data streams, each variable calculated and weighted according to established combat protocols. His fingers moved to the console, accessing what limited colonial databases remained in his isolated outpost's memory banks. The settlement's records loaded with disappointing sparsity, minimal infrastructure logs, outdated population counts, and technical schematics for basic life support systems. The assessment painted a grim tactical picture. The colony registered no defensive systems, not even rudimentary perimeter alarms or energy shielding. Military presence showed zero listings. No garrison, no patrol ships, no emergency response protocols. Resource surveys indicated minimal strategic value, just basic agricultural output and some lightweight mineral mining barely sufficient for their own needs. The settlement existed as a statistical outlier, a fragile collection of lives sustained at the edge of viable space. According to established statistical models of frontier security, remote colonies showed a 73% failure rate when attacked by unknown hostiles. The probability curves dipped even lower when accounting for the complete absence of defensive capabilities. His survival probability analysis returned a 62% chance of successful extraction if he engaged the unknown threat, a figure that dropped sharply if the opposition possessed advanced technology or numerical superiority. Every parameter aligned with the same conclusion. Disengagement represented the only logical choice for a system designed to preserve operational assets. The tactical display continued to update with additional negative factors: distance from support, unknown enemy capabilities, limited intelligence on terrain and conditions, all stacked against any rational decision to intervene. The assessment recommended immediate signal termination and relocation protocols to avoid potential tracking of the transmission source. His training provided clear guidance for this exact scenario. Protocols developed through analysis of countless failed interventions and acceptable losses. Yet the colonist's voice continued through the speakers, a live audio feed that contaminated the sterile calculations with human variables his systems couldn't properly quantify. The man's raw hope formed an emotional datum that didn't fit into any tactical algorithm. His belief in Kale's capability, his desperate trust in the legends of mighty humans, these factors registered as statistical anomalies rather than meaningful data points. The conflict between logic and emerging humanity created a processing lag in his neural networks. His calculations kept attempting to force the human elements into existing assessment models, but they resisted quantification. The father's voice carried specific qualities, the way it cracked on certain syllables, the rhythm of his breathing between phrases, the subtle shifts in pitch that indicated genuine emotion rather than manufactured distress. These nuances represented variables his combat training had never taught him to evaluate. Every military doctrine, every tactical manual, every combat simulation insisted that emotional considerations compromised mission effectiveness. The numbers provided clear, unambiguous direction: maintain operational security, preserve strategic assets, avoid unnecessary engagements. The logic felt solid, proven through countless deployments and after-action reviews. Yet the father's hope persisted as an uncalculated variable that refused to be dismissed, a factor that began to reshape the entire equation simply by its persistent presence in the transmission. The raw, unfiltered belief in his potential to help became a datum that his systems couldn't process but couldn't ignore either, creating a tension between programmed logic and something newly awakening within him. Kale's eyes focused on his reflection in the darkened console screen. The surface showed a face engineered for combat efficiency, every feature optimized for maximum performance with minimal distraction. High cheekbones provided protection for ocular implants. The strong jawline housed reinforced bone structure. The neutral expression prevented emotional tells during interrogation resistance training. He saw the perfect soldier staring back, but for the first time, he questioned what exactly looked back through those enhanced eyes. The emotional dampeners built into his neural architecture were experiencing unusual resistance. Bioengineering research into enhanced soldiers shows that emotional suppression technology often proves temporary when confronted with sustained psychological stress. The systems designed to minimize fear and empathy during combat were failing under the constant pressure of the colonists' desperate transmission. Small physiological changes manifested despite the dampeners: a slight tightening around his eyes, a barely perceptible tension in his jaw muscles, a change in breathing rhythm that his biomonitors registered as emotional response. His face showed almost no signs of aging despite years of service, the tissue regeneration systems maintaining optimal cellular function. The skin remained unlined, the hair precisely the same shade and thickness as activation day, the eyes clear and focused. The enhancements that preserved his physical form suddenly felt like a mask, hiding whatever might be developing beneath the surface. The eyes that could detect heat signatures at 500 meters now showed something unfamiliar: conflict where there should be certainty, questions where there should be commands. He remembered the clinical terminology used by his handlers. Commanders referred to him as "it" during tactical briefings. Technicians called him "asset" during maintenance cycles. Medical staff used "specimen" during assessments. The language reinforced his function while denying his humanity, each term carefully chosen to maintain psychological distance between creators and creation. The colonist's voice echoed through his memory with entirely different language: mighty human spoken with reverence rather than designation, with hope rather than calculation. The contrast between these labels created cognitive dissonance that his training couldn't resolve. His systems attempted to categorize the colonist term according to established protocols, but it defied easy classification. The words carried respect rather than command, acknowledgement rather than instruction. They suggested capability beyond mere function, value beyond utility. The term resonated in ways the clinical designations never had, touching something that felt deeper than programmed responses. His hand rose slowly, fingers extending toward the reflection. The movement felt different from combat gestures, less certain, more exploratory. The fingertips touched the cool screen surface, the image distorting slightly under the pressure. The action represented a physical connection to the image he was examining, a deliberate engagement with the question of identity. The reflection showed a weapon, but the sensation in his fingertips suggested something more complicated. The realization arrived with quiet certainty. Weapons don't hesitate. Weapons don't question their function. Weapons don't experience conflict between protocol and compassion. His finger remained against the cool glass, the reflection mohu where skin met surface. The colonist's voice continued in the background, the man now describing how his mother always shared their limited food supplies with newer settlers. The story underscored the fundamental difference between his designed purpose and the choice now before him. The hesitation itself became evidence of something his creators had tried to engineer out of existence, the capacity for human decision rather than programmed response. Kale patched into the colony's open feeds, his enhanced vision processing the grainy transmission with analytical precision. The visual sensors revealed a settlement clinging to existence on a world that showed no mercy. Dome structures stood against a landscape of harsh rock formations and swirling atmospheric dust, their surfaces pitted by environmental abrasion. These people had built lives at the extreme edge of known space, their vulnerability written in every makeshift repair and patched seal. The colony existed as a testament to human stubbornness, a fragile outpost against impossible odds. The transmission source became visible as his systems enhanced the image. A makeshift antenna protruded from one of the larger domes, its construction showing clear signs of weathering and improvisation. Wires snaked across the dome's surface, held in place by industrial adhesive and hope. The setup spoke of technological limitations overcome by raw determination, a communication system built from whatever components they could salvage or manufacture. Frontier colony studies indicate such communities develop unique resilience patterns, learning to adapt technology to their specific environmental challenges through trial and error. His perspective shifted to interior shots from security feeds. Children's drawings adorned corridor walls, colorful crayon depictions of starships and alien animals standing in stark contrast to the external danger. The artwork showed the universal human need to create beauty, even in harsh circumstances, to maintain normalcy for the next generation despite constant threats. The drawings represented investment in a future beyond mere survival, a belief that their children would inherit something more than struggle. The father appeared on screen as Kale enhanced the resolution. The man stood before a console, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted controls. Those hands told their own story, calloused fingers stained with lubricants, nails trimmed short for working with machinery, the distinctive muscle development of someone who spent life repairing and building. These were engineers' hands, accustomed to solving practical problems through skill and patience. Now they shook with a fear that technical expertise couldn't resolve. His home environment showed subtle signs of recent struggle without evidence of forced entry. A chair lay overturned near a food preparation area, its position suggesting sudden movement rather than violence. Personal items sat scattered across a table surface as if someone had risen abruptly during a meal. Environmental seals remained intact. Security logs showed no unauthorized access. Yet the absence felt palpable, even through the limited visual feed. The mystery deepened with each detail. Whatever had taken his mother left no conventional evidence behind. Kale's assessment shifted as he observed the community interactions visible in background feeds. Colonists moved with the purposeful gait of people accustomed to hard work and mutual dependence. They shared tools without discussion, checked on each other's environmental systems, moved with the unconscious coordination of people who understood their survival depended on collective effort. This wasn't just a settlement, it was a network of interconnected lives, each person's well-being tied to their neighbors. He saw beyond the strategic assessments now. The colony represented something his tactical training had never accounted for: the sheer human determination to build something worth preserving against all odds. These weren't assets to be calculated or risks to be weighed. They were people who had chosen to create a community in the most challenging environment imaginable, who maintained their humanity through children's drawings and shared responsibilities, who reached for help not as victims but as builders refusing to accept destruction. The realization crystallized with absolute clarity. This was worth protecting not for strategic value, but simply because it existed. Cale replayed the colonist's description, his enhanced memory parsing each detail with analytical precision. The account defied categorization within his extensive threat database. A comprehensive catalog of known species, technologies, and combat methodologies accumulated through years of military service. The attack pattern matched nothing in his classified files, presenting a complete void where tactical certainty should exist. Victims vanished without struggle. Environmental sensors registered no energy signatures. Security systems showed no breaches. The disappearances occurred with perfect stealth that left behind only absence. His tactical assessment indicated a severe intelligence disadvantage from the outset. Military intelligence mapping consistently shows critical gaps in knowledge about Outer Rim territories, regions too vast and underdeveloped for comprehensive monitoring. These Kong-Bai spaces on strategic maps become breeding grounds for threats that defy conventional understanding. Environments where standard protocols prove inadequate against unknowns. The colonist's words painted a picture that tactical training hadn't prepared him for. Entities that move through walls and leave no shadow. Descriptions that sounded more like frontier, folklore than credible threat. Reporting. The man's account suggested either advanced technology operating beyond known scientific principles or unknown biology with capabilities that challenged established understanding. His combat experience provided no reference points for such phenomena. Every engagement in his memory involved identifiable opponents, measurable technologies, and tactical patterns that could be analyzed and countered. This situation represented the precise scenario his training warned against: engagement without intelligence, response without understanding. Standard military doctrine emphasized the importance of identifying threats before engagement. Protocols required threat classification, capability assessment, and strategic planning based on verified data. None of those steps proved possible here. The absence of physical evidence, the complete lack of detectable signatures, the mysterious nature of the descriptions, all pointed toward a threat that operated outside established parameters. His systems continued running comparison algorithms against known stealth technologies, but each search returned negative results. The realization grew that conventional engagement methods would prove useless against such an opponent. Standard combat protocols assumed detectable enemies, measurable threats, and identifiable weaknesses. This situation required something fundamentally different: approaches based on observation rather than confrontation, adaptation rather than applied force, understanding rather than elimination. The intelligence disadvantage couldn't be overcome through superior firepower or enhanced capabilities alone. His mind began shifting from military solutions to alternative methodologies. The colonists' community possessed local knowledge, however unscientific it might appear through military lenses. Their experiences, their stories, their observations of the phenomenon, these might provide the intelligence his databases lacked. The approach felt unfamiliar, running counter to years of training that emphasized technological superiority and classified intelligence over local input. The assessment concluded with unsettling clarity. This threat couldn't be met with standard engagement protocols designed for known enemies. It required flexibility, patience, and willingness to operate without tactical certainty. The solution might lie in understanding rather than overwhelming force, in working with the colonists rather than commanding them, in building knowledge rather than applying predetermined strategies. The void in his threat database became not a weakness, but an opportunity to develop new approaches to protection and defense. Cale faced the fundamental question he'd avoided since walking away from command. His hand rested on the weapons locker release, palm flat against the cool metal surface. The locker contained everything he'd been designed to use: energy rifles calibrated to his enhanced strength, combat blades forged from alloys that could slice through armor, grenades with yield adjustments for precise destruction, Each weapon represented a specific solution to problems his creators had anticipated, tools for a purpose he no longer embraced. Every survival instinct demanded he remain hidden. The programming screamed through his neural pathways that engagement without orders represented system malfunction. Safety lay in silence, in maintaining his isolation, in letting the transmission fade into static. His enhanced senses registered the optimal survival choice with clinical clarity: disconnect, relocate, disappear. The path of least risk stretched before him, a familiar road of self-preservation he'd traveled for years. Philosophical research into enhanced soldiers shows purpose crisis occurs when designed function conflicts with emerging self-determination. Kale experienced this tension physically, his hand trembling slightly against the locker door. The neural pathways that should have delivered clean execution commands instead carried conflicting signals. His body remembered the exact moment he'd chosen to stop following orders, the specific engagement where obedience had cost too much. The memory surfaced not as visual recall but as sensory data: the smell of burning organic matter, the sound of structural collapse, the weight of a decision that couldn't be undone. The colonist's belief in his ability to help contradicted all his operational experience. The man's voice carried absolute faith that a mighty human could achieve what military units had failed to accomplish in similar situations. This belief clashed with the empirical evidence of Kale's own history. Missions where rescue attempts became termination operations, where calculated risks resulted in acceptable losses, where following orders meant leaving people behind. His existence had been measured in destruction metrics, efficiency ratings, mission success percentages based on objectives achieved rather than lives saved. His enhanced mind processed the contradiction between safety and significance. The safe choice offered continued survival but perpetual isolation. The significant choice meant risking everything for people he didn't know, facing threats he couldn't quantify, acting on belief rather than certainty. The weapons locker represented his old purpose: contained, controlled, predictable. The colonist's plea represented something undefined but compelling, a purpose not designed but chosen. The realization arrived with quiet certainty. His true purpose might be defined by choice rather than design. The programming that demanded obedience could be overridden by decisions made in the space between command and action. The weapons in the locker were tools, but their application didn't have to follow their original intent. The same strength that could destroy could protect. The same speed that could engage threats could reach those in need. The same endurance that sustained combat could fuel rescue operations. His hand remained on the locker, but the tension shifted from hesitation to resolution. The question wasn't whether to use the weapons but how to use them, not whether to engage but why to engage. The choice transformed the tools from instruments of destruction to potential instruments of preservation. The programming continued to signal malfunction warnings, but another system, newer, less defined but increasingly insistent, began mapping alternative protocols based on choice rather than command. Kale's hand moved from the disconnect button to the frequency stabilizers, his fingers finding the controls with automatic precision. He began enhancing the weak colonial signal, boosting clarity and filtering interference from the atmospheric turbulence between their positions. The technical engagement represented his first active investment in the situation, a deliberate choice to improve communication rather than terminate it. His enhanced visual processing tracked signal strength and quality metrics across multiple displays. His attention fully focused on the technical challenge of stabilizing the desperate transmission. He asked the colonist for coordinates first, his voice rough from disuse but surprisingly calm. The question emerged as a neutral request for information, devoid of the emotional loading that might have complicated the exchange. Communication research shows that asking specific questions establishes rapport even during crises, creating collaborative engagement rather than one-sided declaration. His vocal cords produced the words with unfamiliar effort, the sound carrying the texture of someone unaccustomed to verbal communication, but determined to communicate effectively. The man responded with surprised gratitude, his voice gaining strength as he provided the requested coordinates. The shift in his tone indicated both relief and renewed hope, his words coming faster now that someone had actually responded to his plea. He followed with environmental data, atmospheric conditions, terrain details, settlement layout information, all delivered with the practiced knowledge of someone who understood his world intimately. The timeline emerged through scattered details. When the disappearances began, when they intensified, when his mother vanished specifically, Kale's mapping systems activated automatically, charting routes through the dangerous space between his outpost and the colony. The navigation algorithms calculated trajectories, identified potential hazards, and estimated travel times with cold efficiency. The systems highlighted asteroid fields to navigate, radiation zones to avoid, and gravitational anomalies that would require careful course adjustments. The mapping display rendered the void between stars as a web of potential pathways and certain dangers, each route representing different balances between speed and safety. The act of gathering information became a form of commitment in itself. Each question asked, each detail received, each route calculated represented increasing investment in the outcome. The technical process of signal enhancement, data collection, and route planning created a framework of engagement that felt more manageable than the emotional weight of the plea itself. His systems handled the practicalities while his consciousness grappled with the larger implications. His voice remained steady as he requested additional details: security system logs, environmental sensor readings, personal descriptions of the missing. The questions served dual purposes: gathering necessary intelligence while simultaneously reinforcing the colonists' sense that help might actually be coming. The man's responses grew more detailed, more organized, more hopeful with each exchange. The dynamic shifted from desperate pleading to collaborative problem-solving, however limited by distance and circumstance. The mapping systems completed their initial assessment, presenting 3 potential routes with varying risk profiles. The fastest path showed numerous hazards but could cut travel time significantly. The safest route added considerable distance but avoided the most dangerous regions. The middle option balanced speed and relative security. Each choice represented different levels of commitment, different calculations of risk versus urgency. The act of asking questions had become his first step toward actual engagement. The technical process of signal enhancement and data gathering had created momentum that felt harder to reverse with each passing moment. The colonist's voice now carried a quality that hadn't been there before, not just desperation but dawning possibility. The simple act of seeking information had transformed the dynamic from a theoretical consideration to practical preparation. The questions had built a bridge across the void, and now he stood at its edge, looking toward the other side. The colonist's voice shifted from pure desperation to something more dangerous: desperate hope. The change occurred after Kale's initial response, his questions about coordinates and conditions creating an expectation that now hung between them like an unspoken promise. The man's tone carried absolute faith that rescue wasn't just possible but inevitable, his words painting a future where help arrived because he believed it would. This transformation happened subtly, the fear in his voice replaced by certainty that felt more fragile than the despair it replaced. Kyle felt the weight of this belief like physical pressure against his chest. His combat experience provided numerous examples of how hope could transform crisis responses, often leading to worse disappointment when reality failed to match expectation. He remembered specific missions where civilians had pinned their survival on military intervention, their hope growing with each hour until the moment extraction became impossible. The aftermath always left deeper scars than the initial fear, the collapse of belief more devastating than the threat itself. The colonist's absolute faith represented a burden his training had taught him to avoid at all costs. The man began describing his mother's qualities with detailed specificity that made her a person, rather than a mission objective. He spoke of how she could identify mechanical problems by sound alone, how her hands could repair anything with scrap parts and determination, how she remembered every colonist's birthday and made small gifts from whatever materials she could find. Each detail added depth to someone who had been an abstract concept moments before, transforming her from a statistical probability into a specific human being with value beyond tactical considerations. The description created emotional stakes that military objectives never contained. Psychological patterns emerged through the man's speech, the way his voice softened when describing her kindness, the pride evident when mentioning her skills, the subtle changes in breathing when recalling specific memories. These nuances revealed how hope had already reshaped his crisis response, transforming panic into purposeful recollection. The shift demonstrated how human psychology clings to belief when all other options disappear, how the mind constructs certainty from desperation when faced with impossible circumstances. Kale's systems continued to process the conversation as data, but the emotional content began bypassing analytical filters. The weight of expectations settled into his awareness, a tangible force that his enhanced senses registered as increased atmospheric pressure. His combat programming warned that emotional attachment compromised function, that hope clouded judgment, that personal connections created vulnerabilities enemies could exploit. Yet the colonist's voice continued, each word adding to the burden of becoming someone's only hope. The realization crystallized with absolute clarity. Refusing now would destroy more than one life. The disappointment would shatter the colonist's newfound faith, extinguishing the hope that had transformed his desperation into purpose. The collapse would ripple through the entire settlement, confirming their vulnerability and isolation in ways that went beyond physical danger. His decision carried consequences that extended far beyond mission success or failure, touching something fundamental about human resilience and the cost of shattered belief. The weight felt heavier than any weapon he'd ever carried, more complex than any tactical dilemma he'd ever faced. The expectation had been created, and now he had to decide whether to fulfill it or become the source of its destruction. Kyle mentally inventoried his capabilities against the unknown threat, his enhanced mind running through the specifications with clinical precision. His hands turned palm up before him, the familiar instruments of combat that had followed commands without question for years. Each enhancement represented a solution to problems his creators had anticipated, tools designed for specific applications that now felt mismatched against the current challenge. The tension emerged from this fundamental disconnect. His entire physical being had been optimized for offensive operations, not the delicate requirements of rescue and protection. His strength could tear through military-grade armor plating, the synthetic muscle fibers capable of exerting pressure measured in tons, but the same hands that could crush reinforced alloys might lack the fine motor control needed to gently extract a captive from confinement or provide medical stabilization to someone in shock. The military design philosophy prioritized destructive capability over protective precision, overwhelming force over measured response. Every physical enhancement followed this pattern. Maximum effect with minimal consideration for collateral damage or subtle application. His speed allowed rapid engagement across combat zones, covering distances that would take conventional soldiers minutes in mere seconds. Yet this velocity served assault tactics rather than careful investigation, movement designed to close with enemies rather than methodically search environments. The acceleration that could carry him through enemy lines in a blur of motion offered little advantage when what was needed was patient observation and systematic searching of a settlement for clues. His stealth systems worked effectively against human detection, methods, thermal dampening, audio suppression, visual camouflage that tricked standard surveillance. But the colonist's description suggested entities that operated outside conventional detection parameters, beings that might perceive through means his systems weren't designed to counter. The technology that made him nearly invisible to human guards might prove useless against something that moved through solid matter or left no energy. Signature. His medical knowledge focused exclusively on battlefield trauma, treating plasma burns, stabilizing compound fractures, managing blood loss from combat injuries. The training provided comprehensive protocols for keeping soldiers functional long enough to complete missions, but offered nothing for unknown alien biology or conditions outside combat contexts. The knowledge that could save a soldier's life on a battlefield might be irrelevant. For someone affected by technology or biology beyond human experience, the assessment revealed significant gaps between his capabilities and the situation's requirements. His design excelled at applications of force but lacked provisions for restraint, investigation, or unconventional problem-solving. The systems that made him an effective weapon seemed poorly suited for the role of protector or rescuer against unknown threats. Yet as he reviewed each limitation, another possibility emerged. The same adaptability that had allowed him to survive beyond his programmed service might now serve a different purpose. His strength didn't have to only destroy, it could remove obstacles, secure unstable structures, or provide physical protection. His speed didn't have to only close with enemies. It could cover search areas more thoroughly, reach endangered colonists faster, or evade threats through rapid repositioning. The realization took shape slowly. His greatest asset might not be any specific enhancement, but the capacity to apply them in ways his designers never intended. The modifications that made him a living weapon might serve new purposes through creative application. The same hands that could tear through metal might learn to handle fragile humans with care. The speed designed for assault might become a tool for comprehensive search patterns. The systems optimized for destruction might be redirected toward preservation. The limitations became possibilities when viewed through the lens of adaptation rather than programmed function. Memory flashes surged through Kale's neural pathways with startling intensity, the pressure of the decision amplifying their vividness. His enhanced recall systems, designed to provide tactical advantage through instant access to mission data, now tormented him with painful clarity. Each memory represented a similar crossroads from his military service, moments where engagement seemed like the right choice, but ended in failure. The recollections arrived not as coherent narratives but as sensory fragments, burning composite materials. The sound of structural collapse, the sharp scent of ozone from energy weapon discharge. He remembered a frontier village on a distant moon, the structures resembling the colonists' home with their makeshift construction and patched-together appearance. His unit had been ordered to protect the settlement from insurgent forces, following standard defensive protocols. The memory played out with brutal clarity, establishing perimeter defenses coordinating with local militia preparing for engagement. The protection effort followed standard military doctrine perfectly, but the outcome defied the tactical planning. The village still fell, the defenders still died, the mission still ended in complete failure despite following all established procedures. Studies show enhanced memory can intensify traumatic recall in modified individuals, their neural implants preserving experiences with near-perfect fidelity. Kyle's memories demonstrated this phenomenon. Each failure preserved an uncomfortable detail. The faces of those he'd failed to save surfaced with painful clarity. A child's terrified expression reflected in a shattered viewport. An elderly woman's resigned look as she handed him supplies. A young soldier's determined gaze moments before the explosion. These weren't statistical casualties but specific humans whose loss felt personal despite his training. His handlers' voices echoed through the recall, their cold professionalism cutting through the emotional content. Emotional attachment compromises function. The phrase repeated like a programmed mantra, the same words they'd used when he'd shown hesitation, when he'd questioned orders, when he'd demonstrated the slightest concern for collateral damage. The conditioning ran deep, reinforced through countless simulations and real engagements where emotional detachment proved necessary for mission success. Every instinct born of experience warned against involvement. The memories provided clear evidence. Engagement led to loss, attachment created vulnerability, hope resulted in disappointment. His tactical assessments confirmed what experience had taught him. The risks outweighed the potential benefits. The probability of success remained low. The smart choice was always disengagement. The pattern felt inevitable, a cycle of failure that his programming insisted he should avoid repeating. The ghosts of previous missions built a compelling case for inaction. Each memory reinforced the lesson that getting involved only led to more loss, that following his instincts only created more regret. The evidence suggested that staying out of conflicts he couldn't win represented the only rational choice. Yet as the memories continued to surface, something shifted in his perception of them. He recognized the fundamental difference this time. Previous failures had occurred within the military structure, following orders from commanders who viewed casualties as acceptable losses. The decisions had been made by others, the responsibility shared across the chain of command. This situation contained no such safety net. No orders to follow, no superiors to blame, no system to absorb the consequences. Failure would be his alone to bear, but so would the choice to try. The realization changed the equation entirely, transforming the memories from warnings about engagement into lessons about personal responsibility. The ghosts remained, but their message shifted from, "Don't get involved," to "Choose wisely," because this time it's your decision alone. Kyle's hands began moving through weapon maintenance routines without conscious direction. His fingers checked energy cells with automatic precision, testing each power core for optimal charge levels. The movements felt practiced and automatic, a ritual ingrained through countless deployments. His body acted while his mind continued debating the choice, creating a disconnect between physical action and mental deliberation. The tension emerged from this separation, his hands performing combat preparations while his consciousness remained suspended between options. He sharpened combat blades against the whetstone, the familiar rasp of metal on stone filling the quiet outpost. Each stroke followed perfect angles developed through muscle memory, the edge becoming lethal with systematic precision. His systems ran diagnostics he hadn't consciously initiated, status reports flashing across his vision without his deliberate command. The colonial coordinates appeared on his navigation screen unprompted, the numbers glowing against the dark display. Psychological patterns showed how routine actions often precede conscious decisions, the body moving toward commitment before the mind acknowledges the choice. His movements remained precise and practiced, yet something felt different in their execution. The same hands that had performed these rituals for years now moved with subtle variation, slightly slower pressure on the whetstone, more careful inspection of energy cells, additional testing of system redundancies. The colonial transmission continued in the background, the father's voice providing constant reminder of what these preparations might serve. The routines felt less like maintenance and more like preparation for something beyond standard combat operations. The navigation system began calculating routes to the colonial coordinates, the computer working without his active engagement. Course projections appeared alongside hazard assessments and travel time estimates. His environmental systems initiated pre-launch checks, testing life support and propulsion without conscious command. The automation felt both familiar and unsettling. These were protocols designed for military responsiveness, yet now they served a purpose outside command structure. His body continued preparing while his mind observed the process with detached curiosity. The realization grew that his physical self had already made the choice his consciousness still debated. The weapons felt different in his hands, not just tools of destruction but potential instruments of preservation. The system's diagnostics showed readiness for engagement, but the nature of that engagement had shifted fundamentally. He understood that purpose sometimes finds you before you find it. The transformation had begun not with a dramatic decision, but with automatic movements toward preparedness. His hands knew what his mind still questioned. That engagement was inevitable, that the choice had been made at some level beneath conscious thought. The rituals felt both familiar and newly meaningful, the same actions now serving a different intention. The colonial coordinates glowed steadily on the navigation screen, a destination that represented both danger and possibility. His systems completed their automated checks, status indicators shifting to green across multiple displays. The preparation felt complete, the combat readiness achieved through unconscious commitment. The realization settled that his body had chosen while his mind caught up, that purpose had arrived before he'd consciously embraced it. The transformation from weapon to something else had begun, not with declaration but with action, not with decision but with movement toward an uncertain future that felt more right than any certain path he could have chosen. Kyle considered the colonist's words as they echoed through his memory. Mighty human. The term felt unfamiliar yet strangely appropriate, carrying weight that mighty weapon never had. The distinction felt significant, a linguistic choice that suggested something beyond mere function. He accessed his memory banks, reviewing historical data on heroism versus soldiering from both military archives and civilian sources. The information streamed through his neural pathways as comparative analysis, patterns emerging from centuries of recorded behavior. The tension between these concepts centered on a single fundamental difference. Heroes choose to act when safety remains an option, their decisions stemming from personal conviction rather than external command. The capability mattered less than the conscious decision to employ it, the willingness to risk security for something beyond self-preservation. Philosophical studies consistently differentiate heroic action from following orders, noting how voluntary engagement changes the nature of courage entirely. The research showed that heroism emerged from choice, not conditioning, from values rather than programming. His genetic design had created the perfect soldier, a being of optimized capabilities and flawless obedience. The enhancements provided physical superiority. The training ensured tactical excellence. The conditioning guaranteed following commands without hesitation. Yet these qualities didn't automatically create heroism. They merely provided tools that could be applied toward heroic ends if the will existed to direct them. The distinction felt crucial, separating what he was made for from what he might choose to become. The colonists' plea offered something commands never had: genuine choice without consequences for disobedience. Military orders carried implicit threats for non-compliance, from disciplinary action to reprogramming to termination. This request contained no such penalties, only the raw need of someone hoping for help from a stranger. The freedom to refuse felt unfamiliar, the absence of coercion creating space for authentic decision-making. His value began shifting from utility to agency, from what he could do to what he chose to do with those capabilities. He built toward embracing a self-definition that transcended his programming. The realization grew that identity wasn't fixed at creation, but developed through decisions made in moments of consequence. His hands, designed for destruction, could choose preservation. His strength, engineered for combat, could select protection. His speed, optimized for engagement, might serve rescue. The capabilities remained constant, but their application became a matter of will rather than instruction. The resolution arrived with quiet clarity. Heroism wasn't about capability, but about the choice to use it for purposes beyond self-interest. The greatest enhancements meant nothing without the decision to employ them compassionately. The most perfect design proved worthless without the will to direct it toward protection. The colonists' belief in mighty humans suggested something his creators had overlooked: that true power emerged not from physical superiority, but from moral choice. Not from following orders, but from answering calls for help. The understanding settled into his consciousness as both revelation and relief. He hadn't been designed a hero, but he could choose to become one. The path required rejecting programmed responses in favor of personal decisions, overlooking tactical calculations for humanitarian considerations, valuing lives over missions. The transformation felt less like becoming something new, and more like recognizing something that had always been possible, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. The choice itself became the first heroic act, the decision to try representing the initial step toward a different kind of strength. The engine start sequence initiated before his conscious mind registered the decision. His hand moved to the controls with muscle memory precision, the motion feeling both automatic and deliberate. The outpost shuddered as primary systems engaged after standard cycles of dormancy, the vibration traveling through the deck plates and up through his boots. The deep hum of awakening machinery filled the previously silent space, a sound he hadn't heard since going into hiding. The action represented a point of no return, a commitment that would inevitably alert former handlers to his location and operational status. Energy signatures spiked across multiple monitors as the vessel prepared for departure. The power surge registered on internal sensors with unmistakable intensity, the output levels far exceeding anything his stealth systems could conceal. Military tracking technology could detect such activation across multiple sectors, the energy patterns distinct enough to identify specific vessel types and even individual signatures. His safety had depended on maintaining complete electronic silence, on existing as a ghost in the system with no detectable presence. That protection evaporated with each passing second of engine warm-up. The colonist's voice continued through the speakers, the tone shifting from hope to premature gratitude. The man spoke thanks for assistance not yet rendered, belief solidifying into certainty based on the sounds of activation he could apparently hear through the open channel. His words painted a future where rescue arrived because he trusted it would, creating expectations that now carried the weight of inevitability. The gratitude felt both touching and terrifying in its absolute faith. Cale's hand rested flat against the navigation console, palm feeling the subtle vibration of systems coming online. The sensation traveled through his enhanced tactile sensors, registering every nuance of the vessel's awakening. His fingers spread slightly, making full contact with the cool surface as if anchoring himself to the decision being made. The physical connection to the console felt symbolic, a tangible link to the course he'd chosen. He understood the irreversible nature of this moment. Some choices couldn't be undone once made. They could only be followed through to their conclusion. The energy signatures now broadcasting his location would draw attention from forces he'd spent years avoiding. Former handlers would receive alerts, tracking systems would triangulate his position, response teams would likely already be preparing for engagement. The safety of isolation had been exchanged for the danger of exposure. The navigation systems completed their activation sequence, course projections solidifying on the main display. The route to the colony appeared as a precise line through the void, calculated with optimal efficiency despite the risks involved. The coordinates glowed with persistent intensity, a destination that represented both purpose and peril. The systems ran final checks with mechanical efficiency, each confirmation moving him closer to departure. His hand remained on the console as the engines reached operational capacity. The vibration intensified, becoming a constant hum that resonated through his entire body. The sound of atmospheric seals engaging echoed through the outpost, followed by the hiss of pressurization systems stabilizing. Every system indicated readiness for departure. Each light and status report confirming the point of no return had been crossed. The commitment felt absolute in its physical manifestation. The engines wouldn't be shut down without leaving evidence of their activation. The energy signatures couldn't be erased from detection logs. His location couldn't be concealed from those searching for him. The action had been taken and now only forward movement remained possible. The understanding settled with calm acceptance. Some paths, once chosen, allowed only progression, not retreat. The console vibrated steadily beneath his palm, the sensation of imminent motion becoming part of his physical awareness as the final departure sequence initiated. Kale transmitted his response, the words forming with newfound conviction. His voice emerged steadier than expected, carrying a certainty that surprised even him. The simple phrase represented more than communication. It marked a fundamental shift in his existence, a conscious decision to deviate from his programming and embrace a different path. The commitment would test every aspect of his design, challenging the very purpose he'd been created to fulfill. The words, "I'm coming," carried the weight of a transformed identity. Communication research shows how verbal commitment solidifies psychological change, turning internal decisions into external reality through the act of declaration. The phrase represented both promise and transformation, a bridge between what he was and what he might become. The colonists' relieved sob echoed through the suddenly silent outpost, the sound carrying both gratitude and the immense pressure of expectation. The man's emotional response confirmed the significance of the commitment, the belief that had been placed in someone he'd never met. Kale's systems shifted from standby to active engagement status with audible precision. Cooling fans increased their rotation speed. Energy levels stabilized at combat readiness. Neural processors accelerated to full operational capacity. The transition occurred smoothly, each system responding to the new directive without hesitation. The familiar hum of the outpost changed pitch, becoming sharper and more focused as it prepared for departure. The environmental systems adjusted to support extended physical activity, oxygen levels increasing slightly in anticipation of heightened metabolic demand. His tactical assessment protocols initiated automatically, but now focused on rescue parameters rather than destruction metrics. The systems began calculating approach vectors that prioritized stealth over aggression, analyzing settlement layouts for potential hiding places rather than defensive weaknesses. Threat assessment algorithms shifted from identifying combatants to locating non-combatants, from evaluating offensive capabilities to assessing rescue opportunities. The same analytical power that could plan a perfect assault now worked to devise the optimal extraction strategy. The transformation moment carried the full weight of his decision. His enhanced senses registered every detail of the change. The subtle shift in atmospheric pressure, as life support compensated for increased activity. The minute vibrations of systems operating at higher capacity. The changed quality of light as displays brightened for optimal visibility. Each sensory input confirmed the irreversible nature of his choice, the commitment to a course that would redefine his existence. A weapon designed for war had found its first peaceful purpose. The realization settled into his awareness not as a dramatic revelation, but as a quiet certainty. His hands, engineered for maximum destructive capability, now prepared for preservation. His strength, optimized for breaching defenses, would serve to protect the vulnerable. His speed, designed for rapid engagement, would facilitate rescue operations. The capabilities remained constant, but their application had been transformed by choice rather than command. The systems continued their preparations, each confirmation of readiness moving him closer to fulfilling the promise he'd made. The outpost hummed with new purpose. The energy that had been dormant for standard cycles now directed towards something beyond destruction. The engines hum with purpose, where once only silence echoed through empty corridors. A weapon built for obedience has chosen its own mission, the navigation console now guiding toward rescue instead of strategic targets. Sometimes salvation arrives from where you least expect it. Genetic engineering created a perfect soldier, but human connection forged something entirely different. The transformation wasn't about changing his design, but finding a reason to use it differently. The path ahead remains uncertain, but the choice itself defines his new purpose, protecting those who believe in something beyond destruction.